Uh, Good evening. My name is Bashir Fancy. I am one of the founders at BTPAC, BIZTEK Professionals Association of Canada, and the other founders on the line, and you LW, that's Leon Waxwell, and you'll very shortly be seeing Domenic Vogel, who is a security expert. And rather than me introducing him, he is going to introduce himself. So I'll just hand over the controls to him.
Well, first off, thank you again, Bashir, for having me. Very humble, very honored to be able to share some of my thoughts and musings on cybersecurity. For me, one of the reasons why I sort of entitled this "Cybersecurity: Why It Can No Longer Be Ignored." That's something I'm still seeing in the front lines, dealing with so many small and mid-sized businesses, that even in this day and age, cybersecurity is still being ignored. It's not being seen as an important, even just a table stake item when it comes to doing business. And so that's very much, I'd say, sort of the context of this presentation. And sort of, for me, I'm hoping people, take out at least a couple quick laughs out of the presentation, but as well become a little bit more informed again about sort of what we're seeing. And, just starting off a bit with my background, not going too deep into my ego. And the first thing is that you'll see a consistent Simpsons theme throughout the presentation. I'm very much a product of the early 90s. So if you like The Simpsons, great. You'll hopefully see some really funny pictures throughout the presentation. If you don't like them, it'll be a long presentation. So bear that in mind. So currently I'm the founder and chief strategist at CyberSC. We're an advisory company which focuses on providing cyber risk leadership to small and mid-sized businesses. Previously to that, I held a slew of various corporate roles, but I did spend most of my time in the financial services and the credit union space. That's where much of my, I guess, blood was shed in my early corporate days. I'm also a frequent speaker at various conferences and events throughout North America, as well as pretty much anytime there's a relatively high-profile data breach, I'm interviewed on the on radio, TV, and various social media channels as well. So I do like the sound of my own voice. But like I said, it's just a little bit about me, and sort of moving on to the next slide where we're talking about what I refer to as key outcomes. Some of the themes which I want to be able to hit on in this presentation, and will sort of be underpinning a lot of key messages throughout, will be sort of these key themes. One of the most pressing risks that so many organizations still do not understand. Even the World Economic Forum is consistently labeling cyber risk as being one of the top 3 or 5 risks facing organizations globally. And while we're getting that acceptance at the enterprise level or large organizational level, we're still suffering, or not seeing that. Suffering may not be the right word, but we're not seeing that same buy-in with smaller and mid-sized organizations. So that's still a huge risk right now. And even during this pandemic period, we're still seeing that disconnect in which we're hearing so many small and mid-sized businesses saying, well, we're going to survival mode. We're just focusing on the essentials in order to survive. And when you speak with them, you find out that cybersecurity isn't part of their survival mode. They're saying, oh, once we get out of this, we'll start worrying about cybersecurity. And they don't understand that if you're going into survival mode, especially in this digital economy, cybersecurity is part of that survival mode. And it still shocks me how much of a disconnect there is in the SMB community there. So much more education and awareness is still needed there. And being able to break down some of these myths with them, being able to say, you know what, cybersecurity, it's not about having to spend a ton of money. To me, it's about focusing your limited resources, however limited they may be, on doing the essentials, doing the basics, and doing them well. Don't be an easy target. Having and dovetailing that into the ability to set what's referred to as reasonable levels of security or legally defensible security. Those are core principles to make sure that as an organization or as a business, you're able to demonstrate that you've done what you can given your resources to make things as secure as possible. Right? That's going to go a long way towards protecting trust in your brand, in your business, as well as your reputation. That's still, like I said, such a misconception that these businesses and these organizations think that cybersecurity is complex. It has to be a ton of money. And that's just not the case, again, especially for relatively simple or straightforward small or mid-sized businesses. It can be done relatively easily and from a practical point of view. And even if you even just throw all the threats out the window, what we're seeing as well is that effective security leads to an actual competitive advantage. And as we, and the story I'll share here is that with vendor risk management becoming more and more of an important piece, and sort of clamping down on supply chain risk management, we're seeing larger enterprises really clamp down when it comes to vendor risk management. And that's really affecting small and mid-sized businesses that are in sort of that B2B, business to business market, in which they're now being asked to actionably prove that they have a cybersecurity program in place. We're seeing an evolution in the maturity of vendor risk management, in which now you're not just being asked to fill out a form in which you could basically lie on because no one's going to check on you. Now you're being asked to provide proof. So now we're seeing that become really tying down to the business level, and we've had businesses reach out to us saying, hey, you know what, for years we've been saying we have a cybersecurity program on our vendor risk management sort of checklist. Now one of our biggest clients, who is like 60% of our revenue, they're asking for proof, and we can't really tell them we've been lying, otherwise we're going to lose that business. So it's so important to see that it's not just about worrying about cyber criminals or attackers. There's a key business reason as to why it's necessary right now. And again, that to me dovetails into being able to create value and driving success for the organization. So these are a lot of, like I say, key outcomes for why cybersecurity is so important. And again, this will be underpinning a lot of what we're talking about in the next few minutes here. And as we move on to the next slide here, I'm a big fan of using this as just from an imagery perspective. I still see so many organizations, so many people who have a false sense of security. And to me, when I think of a false sense of safety or false sense of security, I always think of Richard Nixon. If Donald Trump was ever successfully impeached, I'd probably throw him in there, because he's also epitomizes the false sense of being superior, false sense of security. But it's something, like I said, that so many organizations think that they're impervious, that they can't be touched, that no one's going to come after them, that it's not important. So it's so important, and as we move on to the next slide there, I want people to really understand that, yes, a lot of people, especially business people, still have negative connotations when it comes to the word cybersecurity. Can't tell you how many times I've talked with someone who has nothing to do, who's not in the cybersecurity world, and I say, "Oh, well, I do cybersecurity, or I manage, cyber risk for a living," and they're like, "Oh, really? Oh, that sounds boring," or that's a waste of time, or there's still a lot of negative connotation or beliefs around the fact that it's, like I said, a cost center, it's an IT thing, it's a technical problem. It's still not seen as a risk. It's not treated as an enterprise risk or an organizational risk. If it was, you would put it as part of the same portfolio and of sort of organizational risk, personnel risk, I should say, financial risk, operational risk. It's part of that same umbrella. And like I said, it's an opportunity in which I think, as more and more small and mid-sized businesses awake to the fact that this isn't a waste of time, that there's a journey element to this. This isn't simply as simple as upgrading to the latest version of Windows, right? You need to embrace this as a journey. It needs to become intertwined with the growth strategy of your organization. And as we move on to the next slide here, I always like to joke that in life there are three certainties: there's death, there's taxes, and there's cyber attacks, and increasingly more so for small and mid-sized businesses, and especially as we enter this pandemic period, or as we go deeper into this pandemic period, and as more small and mid-sized businesses ignore cybersecurity, and we're already seeing early indicators of this. Cyber attackers, cyber criminals are literally doubling and tripling down on these attacks because they know there's blood in the water, there's wounded animals when it comes to small and mid-sized businesses, so they're going in for kill shots. Now's the time to pilfer data. Now's the time to steal data. criminals are now seeing, even increasingly so, that the small and mid-sized businesses are truly the low-hanging fruit, especially right now, because they're choosing, many of them are choosing to not focus on cybersecurity. And like I said, it's very short-sighted, because they view that as not being part of survival mode. But if something happens when you're in survival mode and you get hit by a data breach, to me, that's game over. It's bad enough trying to survive as a small, mid-sized business a significant data breach when times are good. Trying to survive one when times are bad, that'll probably be the final shot into the coffin. So it's really important that organizations realize this. Again, for many of the same reasons around that. Criminals are seeking data. Data is the gold oil of the 21st century. It can be monetized on so many different levels. And being able to, like I was mentioning earlier about vendor risk management, especially if you're in a B2B relationship, the criminals see that and they realize that the smaller organizations are those easy stepping stones into larger corporate networks. And if you're going to risk not investing in cybersecurity, you as a business are going to risk losing your valuable relationships that you have with business partners, valuable clients, or valuable contracts. It's not just to try and keep, quote unquote, hackers at bay. What's truly at stake is your business. And like I said, that's still a point which just still isn't being hammered home enough. So that's very much sort of what we want to be able to do in this presentation, is help set that table in as sort of least technical terms as possible, demonstrate that this is very much a business problem. This isn't an IT or technical problem. And moving on, this is just trying to set it from a global perspective. And if we go through this is sort of a staggered a slide here in which I know the numbers I mentioned here in 2018 numbers are I would say very much contextual, in which the getting good stats is still very hard to come by because so few organizations still generally report those. But this again is just meant from a table setting perspective, that this is a global problem. This isn't a North America problem. This isn't an Australia problem. This is a global problem. And what I really want to hit home here is that cybercrime is done by professionals, right? This is a professional racket. If they're taking a professional approach to cybercrime, the problem is that the vast majority of small and mid-sized organizations are taking an amateur approach to cybersecurity. So if you have professionals on one side, on the other, guess who's going to win? It's sort of like in a hockey game. If the Toronto Maple Leafs were suddenly going to play against a junior B hockey team filled up 15 and 16-year-olds, well, you would think the Maple Leafs would win. I mean, maybe not always, but it's again putting pros against amateurs, and that's why it's so important that businesses understand that you need to take a professional approach to dealing with cybersecurity. You can't take an amateurish approach to it. And it's very much the thing, like I said, for small and mid-sized businesses trying to zero in even further, is that when we're talking about threats, and ransomware has been on the radar for the past few years, and it's just still run amok in small and mid-sized businesses, and we're still seeing that, and we're very much likely going to see even more ransomware being hit as well during sort of these survival mode times. And what's to me is the troubling bit isn't so much the percentage of organizations that were hit. Again, right now, at least 1 out of 2 Canadian organizations, smaller organizations, have been hit. Numbers likely far higher. And to me, what was still so I struggle with is that the vast majority of them were either forced / chose to pay the ransom. And as such, again, stats are hard to come by, but anecdotally, I'd say anywhere between 20 to 50% of them, of those organizations that were hit once, rather than doing a lessons learned and trying to do a root cause analysis and figure out why did this happen? Why? Ask the 5 whys, and trying to make sure that you lower the risk of that happening again. The vast majority of them, and we hear this from so many businesses, their approach is to just say, well, we're okay paying the ransom once or twice a year. That's going to be our business strategy moving forward. They would rather do that than invest in cybersecurity. I wish that was a small minority, but on the front lines, we still see that with so many small and mid-sized businesses. They are still choosing to pay the ransom instead of investing in cybersecurity. And again, that goes to speaks to, again, from an education awareness perspective, just how grossly misinformed so many small and mid-sized organizations are. And that to me is a very much a systemic problem, which needs a concerted effort to just truly educate and inform as many people as possible. And just trying to make people understand as well that yes, there's ransomware. Yes, we're also seeing the next evolution of ransomware, which is called extortionware, in which sort of data is stolen, and then the threat to release that on some public forum. Now, there's an extortion element to that, so that was always sort of the natural next step and up from ransomware. We're also seeing a ton of phishing, business email compromise, wire, which is basically manifests itself in terms of wire transfer fraud. Again, that is just slamming small and mid-sized organizations. And again, for those organizations that are choosing not to invest in cybersecurity right now, those attacks, which in good times are causing them to reel. Can you imagine in the survival mode if they got hit by one of those three right now? It would be devastating. That would likely be the end of the business. And that brings me to what I refer to as the small business paradox. And I ask this to so many people. I always say, well, which organizations have the most to lose when it comes to data breaches or just cyber risk? Is it the large organizations or is it the smaller organizations? And so many people always say, well, it's the large organizations. They have the most to lose. They have a lot of money at stake. And I say, well, no, that's actually not the case. It's actually counterintuitive. And like I said, it's a paradox of sorts, in which the larger organizations, yeah, they may dominate the news when they get breached, but by and far, there's a short-term impact, and then they end up rising from that. They have the deep war chest to survive it. The organizations that have the most to lose are the smaller organizations. They're the ones, paradoxically, that have to be more vigilant, because this risk, cyber risk, is an existential threat to their very organization. They don't have the deep pockets to survive a big security incident or a big ransomware incident or a big data or privacy breach. They're the ones that have the most to lose. And as such, that's why, like I said, it's a paradox. Even though they're the ones that have the most to lose, by and far, they're the ones who are still under investing in cybersecurity so much. And that's why it's so important to be able to educate as many of them as possible. And as we move on here, that I always joke with Homer that that's one of my favorite slides there, in which I always feel like that's me on a good day. And for me, it's being able to help people understand that yes, this portion of the presentation isn't meant to be all doom and gloom. It's again meant to be table setting, because there's still so much misinformation around cyber risk. I wanted to make sure we're all coming sort of from a consistent place there. And it's not, like I said, all doom and gloom. I want to focus on what I feel are just practical things that any small and mid-sized business should at least focus on, or at least ask their IT team about, or IT provider about, or start asking it from a dialogue question. And on the next slide there, there's different elements here in which I feel is important for small and mid-sized organizations to look at. The first one is at the leadership level. Most small and mid-sized organizations have a gap or a void when it comes to someone who truly understands cyber risk. You generally have someone who is the sort of the CEO, someone who understands the business, someone who understands finance, maybe someone who understands operations, and then the security piece will fall under one of those on one of their desks, but often it'll be on the side of their desk because they have no frigging clue about how to best optimize cyber risk. That's where it's so important that then you engage with a virtual cyber risk leader. And I don't want to make this sound like it's a plug for us, but I'm still a firm believer in being able to make sure that organizations need to have some level of leadership, accountability, and ownership when it comes to cyber risk. Even the smallest organizations need to be able to understand what that means from a leadership perspective. Because if you don't have that discussion at the leadership level, it sure as heck isn't being done as you move further down the organization. So again, the benefit for organizations is that they can get someone on the ground running. They are immediately able to tap into experience. It's more cost effective. They don't have to pay salary or benefits. Again, it's a way to sort of deal with the current talent crunch, which again is a sort of a thread for another day. But to help, make sure that they're able to tap into some level of cybersecurity leadership without having to try and find someone who will B, in-house, B, try to pay that person, C, try to retain that person. It really makes sure that you get that key conduit or that key bridge between sort of the business, IT managed service provider, to make sure that there's nothing being dropped when it comes to how cyber risk is being overviewed, and as how it's being dealt with within the organization. So that the leadership piece is so important. And as we go into the next slide, this is sort of what I refer to as a checklist of sorts. Again, just meant from a dialogue perspective. We hear that from so many small and mid-sized business owners and leaders that they often will just take their IT teams, or if they have an IT guy or an IT team of 2 or 3, or if they have an IT MSP, they'll just take them at their word, because they don't feel empowered to ask questions. They feel dumb because they often, when they're speaking with the IT person, that it's in a very technical tone and they're not sure how to respond to that, or overtly technical terms, and they're not there, that goes over their head. So really, I'd like this to, the point of this is to at least just be a conversation starter, a dialogue starter. Again, some of it should be with your executive team, some of it can be with the IT, your IT team or provider, but just even, like I said, basic questions in terms of, okay, what's our plan? If we get hit by a data breach, what's that plan? Not just a technical plan, but the organizational plan. You need to be prepared in terms of who's going to say what, how are we going to do credit monitoring, how are we going to deal with the costs. A lot of even sub questions to that. A question more so for the IT team or the IT providers: how do you monitor those systems? How are we actively trying to prevent data breaches? How are you verifying the effectiveness of these various security tools that you're telling us about? Being able to make sure, especially in this day and age, how are we making sure that remote access is being done securely, or as secure as possible? Do we know what our mission critical data is? Do we know where it is? Do we know who should have access to that? Is that being reviewed? Even like cyber insurance, are we being adequately insured once we deal with all the risk? Are we doing something to sort of to insure off what the residual risk? A lot of great, like I said, are in my opinion, great dialogue starting questions, in which, when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber risk, there's just often not enough conversation happening. It's often sort of just a wink and a nod, and again, often just seen through a purely technical lens. I hope that this is something which people can sort of take away from an actionable question point of view, and just start having active dialogue both with their executive team and with their IT team and or IT service provider. And then on the next slide, it's being able to break this down even further. Again, just questions that you can follow up on. Again, doing the basics, doing them well. I'm someone who tries not to get caught up in the latest and greatest. I try not to get caught up in the sort of the silver bullet syndrome. I'm still a firm believer in doing the basics and doing them well. Because there's still way too many organizations which are thinking way too down the road and are still struggling with just doing the basics. So again, having those conversations with data backups, asking your IT team or your IT service provider, how are data backups being done right now? What critical files and data are being backed up? Where are they being backed up? Is that being tested? Really important elements there around data recoverability. That's super important, especially in the face of ransomware. Around password management, two key themes there. Do we have password managers to help to help our staff to make sure that they are able to, from a security awareness perspective, may be able to make safe use of passwords? What about multi-factor authentication on maybe if you're using Office 365, G Suite, for your remote access VPN? Super important to explore those conversations. Talking with your IT team about updates. This is still something which is often still so severely overlooked. What mechanisms and processes are in place to make sure that the applications and various systems are staying as up to date as possible? What are the mechanisms for applying those patches? How are we validating that those patches were successfully applied? Basic security software. I hate to say it, but I still come across so many organizations that don't even have basic security software enabled or configured. Asking that to your IT team or to your IT service provider, what's being done on that regard. Now, the last two are ones which I would say are more policy oriented and discussions for the executive team. One is consumer cloud storage access. So that's stuff like Dropbox, Box.com, Google Cloud, or Google Drive. If you're allowing your staff to access anything, you're increasing the likelihood of what I'll refer to as an accidental privacy breach or data breach, in which if a customer database somehow or HR database with social insurance numbers ends up on someone's personal Dropbox, well, guess what? You now have a privacy breach on your hands. So really trying to restrict that further. Unless people need access to something, again, that to me epitomizes the zero trust architecture and the notion of least privilege. People should only be able to access what they need to be able to do their jobs. And when it comes to leadership, again, you are truly accountable for setting up that security culture. Having a very security-minded culture. We've seen this with many organizations. Those that have a strong culture, a security culture, are less likely to be impacted by a severe data breach or a severe security incident. And on the next slide, what we're talking about, again, and I alluded to this earlier, was that we're in a new situation right now, a new normal. I know that sounds somewhat of an oxymoron, a new normal, but being able to understand that there'll be new problems that are now presenting themselves when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber risk. The first one being this notion about remote access. We're all working remotely now, or most of us are working remotely. That's going to be that new normal moving forward. One of the problems which I see so much with organizations, with especially smaller ones, is that there's half a dozen different remote access methods. Some of them are maybe more secure than others. Some of them are allowing just open RDP access without going through that from maybe a secure RDP gateway. Some are just using Go to My PC. Others can just access it directly through Google Chrome. For the business, you need to go through and standardize and say, these are the validated methods or mechanisms in which remote access will be granted, and this is how we're going to secure it. You need to take a structured approach to that. Another one which has just come up again because of this new situation is with video conferencing. And at least at this point in time, something like Zoom's been raked over the coals for not being secure enough, for being terrible software. And again, that's a soliloquy for another day. But part of what I want people to understand is that Zoom isn't necessarily an evil tool, or it's not something which is horribly insecure. To me, before you even get to that point, is that you need to define your business requirements, and being able to understand that as an organization, what are you looking at? Are you looking for something from a usability perspective? How important is security in terms of those conversations? If you're an organization in which you need some sort of video conferencing platform so you can keep up to date with your team, you talk about projects, nothing's really necessarily super secure. You're not dealing with military secrets or nuclear launch codes. Yeah, Zoom is fine. And that's what has really bothered me about some of this conversation, is that this needs to tie back to business requirements. Yes, Zoom could have improved earlier. Yes, they're taking great steps now to try and improve. But to me, a lot of this fallout and battle cry has just been wasted energy, because to me it's this almost as the analogy I come up with. It's like someone buying a sedan and then complaining that it doesn't have 8 seats. Well, if you wanted 8 seats, then you need to list that as a requirement. And as such, you would more likely end up buying a minivan than you would a sedan. So to me, before you start blaming platforms for not being secure enough and all that stuff, to me, it always ties back to business requirements. And any good project, yes, there's going to be security requirements as part of that, but you need to define that back to business requirements, and as such, that is going to inform your purchasing decision, especially around something like video conferencing. I've been talking about this concept throughout, is this whole notion of survival mode, and why it's super important to include and integrate cybersecurity as part of that. Very much anticipating cyber attacks to be doubling and tripling, if not quadrupling, over the next few weeks and months, as more and more of these small and mid-sized organizations go into survival mode. Like I was saying earlier, it's like blood in the water, seeing a wounded animal. Cyber attackers, cyber criminals are seeing this as an opportunity like they've never had before. They're not taking a break. Right. If anything, this is truly a godsend for them to really go in for some significant kill shots. So don't see cybersecurity as a binary, do it or don't do it. You have to do it. Yes, there's going to be various shades of gray in terms of what you can do based on your resources, but you need to do something. You need to have a strategy and plan in terms of being able to make sure that you can at least push the envelope just a little bit, right? Be a little bit more secure. That's going to go a long way. So, I really want people to understand that, yes, we're in a new normal, and that, yes, you may, with limited resources, yeah, you may not be able to spend what you would normally have wanted to spend on cybersecurity, but that doesn't mean that you can totally kick it to the curb and discount it. It is a core, to me, it is a core element of an organization, just like the operations, the financial operations, taking care of your staff. It is a core tenet in this digital economy of making sure that your business survives. And once we get out of this pandemic period, that it'll be that platform which will or launching pad which will allow it to thrive. So do not ignore it, and ignore it at your own peril. And to me, just trying to bring around some more big picture elements here. What we're moving towards is this whole notion of what I refer to as a digital trust experience. And to me, digital trust is going to become a strategic business goal moving forward for organizations. It's something which is a moving target. It's going to be a key metric. It's going to be a KPI for companies moving forward. Maybe not necessarily in this pandemic period, but I very much see as more and more businesses move online and spend more time online, that this notion of digital trust is going to become a core element of enduring customer relationships. And we're already sort of seeing some tides of change here when it comes to customer attitudes around security and privacy changing. We're seeing greater privacy regulations change. Some people have been worrying about that with all these data breach stories, that people would become numb to it. I think what we're seeing is this, like I said, the tides of change, where I would say over the next few years, we're going to see greater customer advocacy and consumer advocacy around security and privacy, just like how we did for automobile safety in the late 80s and early 90s. It's going to become something which is going to be very important, and which organizations are going to compete on. Sort of the example I give is with, like I was referring to there, with car safety. With cars and automobiles, they never competed on safety. That was never something which was an issue, not until Ralph Nader in the US took on that whole notion of consumer advocacy and car safety. That became more of a thing and became super important. There was greater regulation around that. And fast forward to today, when you watch a car commercial, more often than not, what are they competing on? They're talking about safety ratings, safety stars, safety awards. That's what they're competing on. That's going to be the direction that we're going to move towards here with digital companies and the digital economy. That is going to be a new battleground in terms of how organizations sort of mark themselves against their competitors. That's going to be intertwined with longer term digital transformation. So that's what, if you're smart, what I feel, like I said, where the market is going, you need to focus on being able to deliver trust inspiring customer experiences. So start now. Use this as an opportunity during this downtime to really rejig things and make sure that you move towards that direction of being able to, like I said, deliver those trust inspiring customer experiences. And I think we're on the home stretch here. I'm a big fan of trying to end my speeches and talks with examples and with analogies. To me, what I wanted to drive home on this point is the whole notion of, it is a bit of a buzzword, but it does hold true. The whole notion of looking at cyber risk management from a holistic perspective, not just through a technical lens, but seeing this for what it is. It's a business issue. So the analogy I'm giving here, in the story I'm giving, goes back to World War II, and the U.S. Navy was looking at the planes that were coming back from various missions, seeing what they could do to improve the safety of these planes, to make sure that they would, that more of these planes, or a higher percentage of them, would return safely after flying various missions. And so what they did was they decided to shore up all the spots which were being shot up on the plane. So anywhere where there's bullet holes, they added extra armor there, thinking, okay, when the planes fly out, more of them are going to fly back safely. But they didn't see any increase in that. There was no increase at all. And then they realized that they were only looking at a small sample space, and they didn't, again, think big picture, in which that the planes that were coming back with those bullet holes, those weren't kill shot because those planes were able to come back. They were able to survive those bullet holes. So they realized that where they should be actually shoring things up is in the areas that were not shot. They could say that they could make the safe assumption that in all likelihood that those were areas that because they were returning intact, they can make the safer assumption that the greater likelihood that it was those spots which were weaknesses in the plane. So they shored those areas up with extra armor, and then they saw an improvement in terms of the number of planes and percentage of planes coming back safely. So again, not directly related to cyber risk here, but again, it's that whole picture of understanding. You need to look at this from a big picture perspective. This isn't just something that IT is going to solve. This isn't just a technical problem. It is a very big picture item here. And just moving on to the last slide, or what I think is the last slide. Yeah. So, and if we move on from the slide from this, that has my contact information. So for people, please reach out anytime. I love it when people reach out, email, Twitter, LinkedIn, visit our website. You can give me a call through the number there. Please feel free to reach out anytime, even if you just want to have a discussion. I'm not going to send you a bill. I'm not one of the big four consulting firms. I genuinely enjoy the human interaction. So thank you so much for this time and for this opportunity. And I hope to hear from some of you soon.
So thank you very much, Dominic. It was a very excellent presentation, which because you covered pretty good ground here, and excellent. I thought would be good to have your take on a couple of things that I have here, which is that we talk about new normal, given some of the incidents that have happened about N95 masks not being allowed to come to Canada. And we have seen something like that also happening in Europe. And the Premier and the Prime Minister, they all, certainly the Ontario Premier talked about it. That's not going to happen. We're going to start doing things here, never be in this situation. I heard something similar because although it's not hit the news, some organizations who have outsourced overseas have run into the same problems, right?
Yes.
So the question is, there's two parts. One is it's outsourced at the moment. How do you keep it secure, given that those countries have shut down for 3 weeks and 2 weeks and 1 month and whatever, they're having the same problems. Secondly, we will obviously start to bring some of the things back. I have very little doubt that that's going to happen, right? That a lot of the things are going to be brought back so that they are not caught in this situation. How do you see both the risks at the moment being outsourced there? How do you now protect it given these challenges? And what happens when they bring it back? Then I've got another couple of follow-up questions. So go ahead.
And I hope I heard all that question because there's a bit of a dropout there. But for me again, if I heard it correctly, like I said, there was some dropout there. But to me, this is really understanding the broader supply chain risk.
Yes.
and really understanding in terms of understanding that where is there too much reliance on certain elements, and within the supply chain risk? Because I'd say a lot of stuff has been taken for granted over the years without really saying, okay, with these various relationships, various spots within the supply chain, are there redundancies? Is there areas where if something was to fall through, can we get supplies or get other things through that? And I think what we're seeing as well is sort of a somewhat a pseudo-systemic problem in which there's been I'd say blind reliance on things, just taking things for granted, or blind reliance on the supply chain without digging down and saying, okay, what are some of those even vital areas within the supply chain? Do we have, depths 1 or 2, 3 layers down in terms of if something, to me, even lack of better, I'll even phrase that even better, resilience. How much resilience is there in the supply chain? And I think that it's still quite fragile. There's not nearly enough resiliency built into it.
So, and that's actually a good point. A couple of things, like you talked about the insurance, right? We know that insurance will not pay out if they find that you were negligent and didn't do certain fundamental things. So insurance by itself is not going to give them, it's a false sense of security, as you quite rightly pointed out. So they have to do some basic fundamental things to protect the business, right? If you don't do that, why would you get protected by insurance? So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that, a lot of the companies, they have or they don't have the audit rights to be able to go in at the moment to review and understand. Now, the reason I bring up these two, three things is the fact that the businesses with shut down have lost revenues, and they're going to be striving to keep their costs down, right? So they will have some challenges. So there are shortcuts, as you quite rightly pointed out. And if you're a smaller organization, you might do more of that. How do they protect themselves? Which of course means education. But to the off the corner switch, say, by the way, you're cutting back, but you can't cut back here. But also the fact that where do the responsibilities lie? Because you can outsource the work, we don't outsource responsibility. And then contracts, do the contracts not need to be reviewed again to see, are they addressing the new normal, these challenges we're talking about? So hopefully you heard that whole.
Yeah, no, and that's such a so many good points there, Bashir. To me, I think there's just still this fundamental lack of making sure that there's clear, lack of better terms, sort of roles and responsibilities. That is still so overlooked. That there's still so many assumptions built into some of these relationships, and especially during this pandemic period right now. I think more than anything, what we need is clarity. So many contracts are overtly legal. They're spelled out in overtly legalese terms that, apart from the general counsel, no one else understands what the F they're saying.
Yes.
I think now is the time to break things down, provide clarity, provide simplicity. I think there's going to be an increasing pressure for that, in which now isn't the time to have complexities. We're seeing enough of a sort of a breakdown in our various complex systems, which are sort of hampering some of our abilities to deal with this pandemic and to deal with it effectively. If anything, I think there's an opportunity for us to strive for greater simplicity and sort of hit a reset button of sorts and say, well, maybe we have made things too difficult than they need to be. Where can we find greater efficiencies? Where can we break down barriers, and use this as that opportunity? Because I think there's still a lot of artificial barriers that have been thrown up as a result of, like I said, from like in legal contracts or what have you. I think there's a lot of these artificial barriers, which, for lack of a better term, are man-made barriers, which are impeding many people's abilities to do the right thing right now.
Now that leads to a couple more questions, and then what we'll do is, our viewers, as Dominic quite rightly pointed out, if you have questions after you heard the presentation or any of the discussion we're having now, please send in your emails to the Dominic. And if you misplaced that, it's already on the presentation. Send it to info@btpac.org, and we will get Dominic back to answer a lot of the things. But here are the two last points. One is that in traditional organizations, and big ones and some mid-sized, they give you a laptop which has been imaged, so you can't download anything on it. The organization can kind of keep some sort of control over it. That's changing. They have recently, in the last few weeks, told people to go buy the laptops or use their own laptops. Now, where's the security going to come from on that? Because when you talk about tunneling and the way you go about it with the VPN and so forth, that is part one. The second issue there is that when you start looking at the fact that you're giving them control and you don't have the disk image to sort out, how do you monitor what exactly is happening on that computer if people are downloading apps, music, whatever? And that means two things, because everybody's not bad. It's not because they are trying to commit some criminal acts. It's because they don't know any better, which means it comes back to education. We know that we have not been very good at that, because we've got silos, and a lot of the business, in fact, operates in such a manner that the left side does not know what the right is doing. I see that all the time. And now you're asking people to buy laptops. Universities have gone out in the last few weeks because they had to go through the exam, or people's entire years of those students would have been wasted. So they've handed out Chromebooks. How do you make it secure that somebody doesn't cheat on the exam, for example, right? Everybody doesn't do it, but the few may do it. So there are a lot of things now to think about that they haven't. And the last part in that is when you outsource, you built that technical expert and security expertise was built at the third party, whether it was in the cloud or whatever. Now, when you're forced to bring it back, you bring it back because the circumstances have changed. How are you going to build that skills back? Because we keep talking about skills gap. So I know that's loaded question with few points, but give it a go.
the first thing I'll say to that, as well as that, I think this is going to really help some of the straggling companies which are still stuck in the old perimeter-based approach to security, stuck in the old network perimeter approach. I think this very much, again, is the truly will bring things to an end for that old approach of things, because the new perimeter is very much at the identity level, the user identity level, and at the device level. And as such, we need to re-architect sort of infrastructure and architecture to reflect that, because now we're not all operating within the same head office. We're not necessarily always going to be in the same headquarters. It's really about a bunch of mini perimeters floating all around the world. Yes, there's been larger organizations, larger enterprises are probably in a better position to deal with that. They're probably further along in the maturity game from that perspective. I think that's going to be a big hop for many small and mid-sized businesses to move towards. Maybe that even helps them even just push everything into the cloud. Maybe they'll just rely on fully cloud areas, so they can just, again, better focus on their shared responsibility there from the user perspective and the data protection perspective. So I think that's a key piece there, is really understanding the ability that the traditional perimeter, and as security professionals, we've been saying this for the past decade plus, but it's still very prevalent thinking that, the traditional perimeter is still alive and well. So I think this will be an opportunity to truly bury it and move towards a more secure architecture around the perimeters that still are fundamentally not receiving the same amount of attention that they should be, and that being sort of, like I said, at the user identity level and at the device level. So I think it's going to be interesting to see the types of solutions and platforms that come out that address those perimeters, so to speak.
I think you're right. We can't talk about legacy systems. We need to worry about legacy thinking, which means, like you talked about the cloud, as long as we don't get our heads in the cloud, data in the cloud security is okay. Leon, do you have any question you want to ask?
I was wondering, one of the things that I've always found with security is that, last but not least, it comes down to people. And particularly in the development area, while there are new tools available, how do you properly protect yourself from the insiders who may be abusing their particular position?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that's the whole, to me, I hearken that back to just, again, basic foundational pieces around knowing what your critical data is. And there's still so many organizations, even just with basic level, I go into organizations and say, well, can you tell me what your most important critical data is? What makes your organization work? I ask 10 different people, I get 10 different answers. If I say, well, where does that data live? Ask 10 people, I get 10 different answers. Who has access to that data? I ask 10 people, I get 10 different answers. So fundamentally, again, around that, another perimeter is around sort of the data perimeter, in which there's still, at the data level, we're still lax when it comes to data level controls. Yes, there's encryption. Yes, there's other things. But again, from almost like from a governance perspective, that's still severely lacking with so many organizations. So to me, even just answering those three questions of what is that critical data, who has access to it, and where does it live, if we can just more consistently answer those three questions, we'd be in a hell of a lot of a better spot. But I still think we're far away from that. But we need to move towards that direction.
Just thinking out loud here, the problem I found is that you have to, the people you need to protect yourself against are the people who need access to the information in the first place. So if a designer is designing something, he needs to have access to, say in a bank, a database that he can work with. And so it's a real challenge. On the one hand, you have to trust people. On the other hand, you're almost down to the point where you need to have the technical person being watched by another technical person, being watched by some supervisor to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And it gets horribly expensive and ineffective.
Yeah, and you know, and again, back to what we're seeing. Yes, there's the and this is where it's almost like where do you focus your limited resources? And yes, the malicious insider is definitely an issue and definitely does need attention. But when you sort of tie that back and you look at big picture in terms of data breaches, and this is why I'm a sort of a big proponent of at least just starting with the basics. For most organizations, still, most data breaches get tied back to what would be labeled as an accidental exposure. You know, so again, let's do the basics, and we build towards that. Being able to get greater visibility in terms of what's happening within the network, who's accessing what at any given time. That to me ends up being, again, a maturity goal which you move towards. But let's start with the basics and move towards that, because to me that end goal is having strong visibility throughout the organization, so you can sort of see who's accessing what at any given time. Yes, there's platforms for that. Yes, that's expensive, but my hope is that for organizations that can't afford that, those organizations generally don't even do the basics. So do the basics, build that over the next 3-4 years, and you know we'll see sort of those tools drop in price as well. So it's there's just so, that's what makes it so confusing. There's so many different elements that one could be working on. That's why it's like, let's strip out the noise. Let's focus on the foundations, because it's like the ABCs. There's still way too many organizations that can't do the ABCs when it comes to security.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Well, one of the things, Dominic, they could do, and we have done that in the past, and I think now is a good time to do it, which is to have very good audit trail, right?
Yes.
Of when you touch a data, who touched it, why, and you set up rules. Given the fact that we got very good algorithms, and we're talking about AI, never mind machine learning, with AI, you could actually set the typical role of a person, just like what Leon asked about in a bank, you're accessing this, in the pattern of when you do it and how often, what type of thing you're looking at. The minute you start to go outside the pattern, you know, those things can be flagged to be reviewed by somebody senior, right? Yeah. To say, okay, it's normal, no problem. So you normalize that. You would then find anomalies. I don't know how good we are at doing that, but that's what, I tell you, the thinking that you talked about, one is the education that all three of us have talked about. One of the other part is that, and I look back at PCI compliance, right? And say, what was the purpose of that? It was not, we didn't want people to keep getting, ROCs and sending it in. That was not why we developed that. It was to make people secure. So it was a change of behavior. But now the thought process out there is to get a piece of paper to say I'm compliant, when we know nobody really is compliant, right? So who's taking the risk here? You are, because if you get compromised and if you don't, you can't demonstrate that you were actually compliant at the time of the breach. It doesn't matter. You are still responsible and you still have to pay all the costs. So the thought process has to be, let me not try to cut the scope. Let me prioritize. Like exactly what you're talking about. You got so much money. Where are you going to protect that plane? Where are you going to get hit, right? And you start to do that and make it part of the building blocks. Education becomes part of that. So I think you hit all the boxes pretty good. And And now we'll wait for the questions to come from our viewers, unless Leon, you got another question. Otherwise,
I had a situation where I performed a particular transaction online at the bank, and I got a transaction number. And then I discovered there was a problem with that transaction. I called up the bank. They said, "Here's the transaction number," and they said, "That doesn't mean anything to us." And I said, "Pardon?" So, I mean, I was just flabbergasted. The other observation, again, you were talking about logs. I am absolutely horrified by large and small companies. Logging is awful. I mean, it's unusable unless you have very special tools and a lot of patience. And to me, that's one of the major security areas that makes people vulnerable. Because if the logs are proper, they contain information that is vulnerable for the company. So how do you deal with that balance?
I think you encrypt them and use technology, not people to get at it, which has got keys in it. And so, yeah, it's obviously we're not going to design a solution here, but you're asking making a very good observation. And yeah, we don't need to edit this comment out because it's a legitimate issue that is actually happening, because there's no point having logs that are available to the world, and especially if you got valuable information, then we need to change the paradigm in thinking that a lot of the kids and other people are putting out information, whether it's like Hangout is recently, House Party. House Party is in the news big time as is Hangout, right? More House Party, because they collect a lot of data. It was bought out by a company called Fortnite. Now, if you're collecting that much data, which you don't need, it's like when you download an application and Dominic, your view would be interesting. Is that they want access to your camera and your phone and your database, and I'm saying, what the heck do you need the access to all that for, right? If you're enabling me to talk to somebody, why do you need access to my cameras? Because you can see each other. You need access perhaps to my contact and my microphone for me to be able to talk. Why do you need access to all my files, right? Any comment on your side on that?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and then I do have to drop off because I have a 4:30, which I'm late for. That again goes back to the whole notion again of access controls and data access, in which so many people, when this is very true, especially with mobile apps on your smartphone or your tablet, in which people will download an app and they'll just install it. They won't. Most people don't look at they won't think twice about what that app is asking to access. I was with my daughter and she was downloading like some flashlight app, and then I was helping her download that, and it said, "Oh, it needs to access," like you were saying there, Bashir, it needs to access your files, needs to access your camera. I was like, this is a damn flashlight app. It should access nothing other than the ability to turn on the light on the phone. And I think again, this speaks to the fact that there are most developers again many developers don't understand the notion of secure coding. They don't understand the notion of the risk of overly permissive access and the risks that go into that. So you shouldn't be creating apps that allow for that. Again, some people are doing that maliciously, so they can try and access stuff they shouldn't and try and sell that. There's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff that's going on there. But from an education perspective, people need to just, again, moment of pause when you're installing an app. Actually take the time to say, does this actually need to access my contacts or my images or my folder or my camera? Introduce a moment of pause.
Fantastic. Dominic, I want to thank you tremendously on behalf of Leon, myself, and BIZTEK Professionals Association of Canada, which is BTPAC, for taking time to do that. In case people didn't realize, Dominic is actually doing this from Vancouver, and we are here in Toronto. So the physical distancing and socially active part works very well.
We are being good citizens,
Yeah,
Bashir.
yes, absolutely. We're not practically, all three of us are actually in our own homes. So as you view this recording and you have comments, questions, please let us know, and we'll make sure this is not the one-shot deal. We will be back here with Dominic and answer whatever questions that you have, and hopefully you will benefit. And if you can take a step back and think about some of the stuff you heard, then we are, I guess, achieving something. So thank you very much once again, Dominic, on behalf of Leon, myself, and BT Pack for doing this tonight.
Thank you, my friend. It was a true honor. Thank you again.